Thank you all for coming this evening. I know that it's Thursday evening in Sofia. I'm sure there's lots of really interesting things you could be doing. So I hope to hold your attention for an hour or so, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. If you want to ask questions on the way through, you certainly can. Just raise your hand, and I'll do my best to answer as we go along. I also have some questions for you. I see a few familiar faces from the Real World Crypto Conference or Symposium. So maybe you can show me your hand if you've come from RWC. A few people. Thank you for making the effort to get across town. For the rest of you, how many of you have taken some kind of course in cryptography before? A few. And how many of you never took a course in cryptography, but you could spell it if you had to? Okay, so it's a pretty mixed audience. I'll do my best to address some remarks to everybody in the room. Maybe one final question for those of you who've never taken a course in cryptography. How many of you have never used cryptography before? Anybody in the room never used cryptography? One or two hands. Do you have a mobile phone? You're using cryptography, okay? So actually, the point, really, the starting point for the talk is to say that actually cryptography is now essentially everywhere. It's in our pockets, it's on our bank cards, it's involved in almost everything we do online. And so cryptography is actually kind of in a golden age. So once upon a time, cryptography was something that emperors and generals would use, but nowadays we use it everywhere, and it's spreading more and more widely. And so here's 3 columns showing different kinds of applications of cryptography over the decades. And the ones on the right-hand side are what you might call applications of advanced cryptography or fancy cryptography, which means going beyond simple things like encryption or digital signatures towards much more advanced primitives like fully homomorphic encryption. So at the conference today, we had a talk by engineers from Apple talking about how they're using fully homomorphic encryption in production to analyze photographs and find similar photographs, for example, in a kind of private way. So 15 years ago or 20 years ago when FHE was finally realized, this was like an impossible dream, but now we're kind of really in this golden age where cryptography is popping up in more and more complex ways in all kinds of systems that we rely on. As part of that, there's a sort of a standard model of how cryptography gets invented and then deployed. And the standard model looks like this. I don't know if any of you recognize what this is, but it's a lecture notes in computer science volume corresponding actually to Eurocrypt 2024. Okay, so researchers get together, they write research papers, and then they present them to each other at conferences. And then somehow, with some magic, this gets translated into industrial products that we're carrying around that we're using every day. Okay, so this is like a very I would say naive model. I'm not the only person who thinks that. So there's a very interesting recent research paper published at Usenix Security 2024 by Fisher et al., where they interviewed a bunch of cryptographic researchers and engineers and people working in standardization and came up with this much more complex model of how cryptography makes its way essentially from the left-hand side of this diagram to the right-hand side of this diagram, starting with up in the top left corner, starting with security, what does it say? Proofs and formal verification, and then cryptographic applications and protocols and so on. Okay, and then different kinds of researchers doing cryptanalysis, doing security proofs, interacting with each other, and then things make their way into standards and into specifications of various kinds, and also into secure implementations in cryptographic libraries, which then people working in product development use to build products that contain cryptography. Okay, so this is the view that they arrived at from talking to a lot of people in the research field and in the engineering side of cryptography who are doing this kind of thing. It's a much more sophisticated picture than this picture would lead you to believe, but actually, I think this picture is wrong. And I'm going to explain from the kind of limited evidence that I've gathered over the last 20 years or so of looking at cryptography and products, that actually there's quite a strong barrier that exists between the left-hand side of this picture and the right-hand side of this picture. So a lot of products are developed without really a strong basis in theory or a strong basis in the engineering of cryptography, but developers have a deadline and they write some code and they need to use some cryptography, and then guess what? They get it wrong. Okay? So cryptography is one of those things. It's a very powerful tool, but it's also a very dangerous tool in the wrong hands. Okay? And of course, the way to address this issue is through education. So it's actually really nice to give this talk here at a university and maybe introduce some of you for the first time to some of the complexities of cryptographic design. And if the only thing you learn by the end of this lecture is that you shouldn't design your own cryptographic algorithms, that's good. That's a win, okay? If that's the only message you leave with. Okay, so let me explain the title of the talk, What is Cryptography in the Wild? It's taking this diagram and zooming in on a particular part of the diagram. In particular, what we do is we look for interesting examples of cryptography that are deployed in products and real systems, and we analyze them, and we either find vulnerabilities in them, and then, of course, we report those vulnerabilities in a responsible manner, so we do coordinated vulnerability disclosure, and depending on the system, we also build security models and formal proofs for cryptography in deployed systems. So we kind of reverse engineer out of the system what the cryptography is doing, build a formal model of that, and then try to prove mathematical properties of that model. Of course, it's only a model, so the model is it's only a reflection of reality. It isn't really reality. So there are limitations to this approach, particularly when it comes to proving things. But the overall outcome of this kind of process is to help the people who rely on these systems, that's their users, in fact, to gain better assurance about their security, right? So when we do this kind of research, I'll come back to this theme later, but we see our primary responsibility as being to the users of those systems, not the vendors who are developing those systems. And sometimes this causes confusion. So cryptography in the wild then is really focusing on this part of the picture. It's ignoring everything on the left-hand side and saying, let's look at cryptographic libraries and standards, and let's look at cryptographic products. Let's see what's going on there and analyze that and see what we can learn from that. With the end goal being to help the people sitting on the right-hand side of the diagram, the users, and also organizations relying on these technologies. And if you go to a normal cryptography conference, if you had gone to Eurocrypt 2024 in Zurich last year, the vast majority of the people and the research was in this pink box. Okay? There's very little activity in the standard academic community to look into the pink box, to look into these blue boxes and figure out what's going on there. The conference that's happening this week in Sofia, Real World Cryptography, is very much about what's happening in those blue boxes, and it's bringing together academia and industry to talk about cryptography in the wild and cryptography in the real world. But the vast majority of cryptographic research that's done in academia is sitting over in the pink box. So let me just say a little bit more about crypto in the wild, the what. Crypto in the wild then is not about the standard model that I showed before of developing new cryptographic research ideas and then gradually pushing them towards practice. I think that's still an incredibly valuable activity, but it's not what we're doing when we do crypto in the wild. And of course, in the ideal world, all cryptography would be developed like this. Okay, we would be writing research papers that are in some way connected to practice and then are picked up by the engineers and developers and then turned into working products with this kind of security guarantees transferring across from the research papers into the products. Okay, but my contention is that in the real world, it's not how most cryptography is developed. So the standard model is incredibly useful, but it's actually very widely ignored in practice. And I'll give you some evidence for that in the rest of the talk. Let me say a little bit about how we decide what to look at when we do cryptography in the world. What makes something interesting, a product interesting? One factor is just the size of the user base. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about Telegram. And currently, Telegram has nearly 950 million users. So if you can say something about the security of Telegram, you're saying something about a system that many, many people rely on. And from my side, that makes it intrinsically interesting and valuable to look at such systems. There's also the sensitivity of the user base. So sometimes we pick systems that don't have a very large user base, but the users are very sensitive. So maybe protesters or potential protesters in countries where the government is repressive. Or apps that are developed specifically for privacy-conscious users in mind. Local importance also comes up. So we did some work on Threema, which is like the Swiss messaging app. And one of the reasons that we looked at it is that we are the Federal Institute of Technology at ETH Zurich. And actually, Threema was being used heavily by the Swiss government, in particular the Swiss army. So somebody had to take a look and see what we could find. So we also look for things that are like interesting from the cryptographic point of view. So if they're using some kind of new cryptography or non-trivial cryptography, they're combining things in an interesting way, that usually means it's worth a look. You're probably going to find something interesting. Either way, either broken or secure. We also make our lives easier by tending to focus on systems where we have access to the source code or some kind of technical specification. You can usually start with a technical specification. That may be an RFC, or it might be a white paper that the company with the product has developed, and then start the process from there. It's much, much harder just to do reverse engineering on some obfuscated code and figure out all the functionality from there. And actually, this is interesting because this does mean that there's this old saying that there's no security from obscurity, right? You don't get security by obscuring your code or what you're doing. It's actually not true. There is security from obscurity because people like me probably won't look at your code base if it's too obscure. Okay, so I'm not encouraging that as an approach. I think open source is very important. But it does mean that there's a barrier to analysis, for good or for bad. Okay, I mentioned white papers already. Another thing that we look at is, what do the vendors say about their own product? Do they claim that it offers military-grade encryption, for example? That's a red flag, right? If a vendor is saying that, it probably means they don't really know what they're doing when it comes to cryptography, because there is no such thing as military-grade encryption, right? It's just made up, it's a marketing term. So often you look at vendor claims and you say, that can't be true. Let's take a look, okay? So that's an interesting way to go. And then also we look at vendors' threat models. How do vendors think of adversaries against their systems? Often they will make quite bold claims that they're secure even against the vendor themselves. So if the vendor running a service in the cloud was able to send bad messages to a client, for example, that shouldn't lead to any security vulnerability. So this is like a malicious service provider scenario. So those kinds of threat models are very strong, and actually it's difficult to achieve security in those threat models. So that means that we feel it's more likely that we will find some kind of vulnerability. And the final criterion is just like, how does it smell? Right? So you put all of this information together and you say, do I have a good feeling or a bad feeling about this? And then that might trigger you to think about attacks rather than proofs, for example. So a little bit on methodology. How do we go about doing this? And this is really here, maybe this is aimed at the researchers in the room. If you ever write a research paper in this domain, referees might ask you to explain what your methodology was. Okay? That comes up a lot in reviews that we get on this work. So we wrote a paper for you which describes the following methodology, and you can just refer to that paper in your methodology section and you're covered. Okay? So we've done that work for you now. I'm sort of joking, but I'm also serious. It's a serious point that for a long time we did this work without really thinking through how we were doing it, were we doing it in the best way possible, could it be improved? And so I give you now the methodology. It's very simple. For attack mode, you define the target system that you want to look at, you develop the relevant threat models for yourself, keeping in mind that the threat model that the vendor proposes may not be the correct threat model. Then you read the white paper and the code, and then you enter a loop, a do loop. You build pseudocode models describing the cryptographic core of the system, so you extract the cryptography and figure out what it is. You come up with attacks, so this is where you think hard, and then you build and test proof of concepts for those attacks. Okay, so it's important that to understand that attacks that you write down on paper that maybe should work in theory may not work in practice, because there could be all kinds of odd behavior that are not described in your cryptographic core but are actually part of the product. So you really have to test out whether your ideas work. And you do that until you've found enough attacks. And then you run a disclosure process with the vendor and you write a research paper. Okay? So there is the first half of the methodology for all of you if you need to refer to a methodology for research in this domain. Okay, how do we find attacks? Well, so this is really referring to 4.2 in this methodology. Where do these attacks come from? Well, over the years, we've built up kind of a big library of things that we look at, that we know to look for. And this is like, that sense of smell that you develop for where are the vulnerabilities likely to be, if there are vulnerabilities. And there's a whole big long list of things that over the years we've figured out probably can be exploited one way or another. So there's a list here, and I'm sure there's things missing from this list that you could also add. So these are the kinds of things that we look for when we're in attack mode. The process for proof mode is very similar. The first few steps are identical to attack mode. And then we go into another do loop. And in this do loop, again, we start by building pseudocode models. So pseudocode is meaning like a kind of high-level description of the cryptographic operations. Maybe it's faithful down to the byte level because maybe that matters for your attacks or for your proofs. You want to try and build a model that's faithful to the cryptography that's being used in the sense of like capturing all of its behavior. But you can't go down too low. You can't go all the way down to assembly language level or something because it's like too detailed for doing proofs, currently at least. Then we develop suitable security models, and then we write the security proofs. Okay? And of course, we do this until we have enough proofs, and then we write a research paper. Okay, and this is meant to be slightly humorous, but there's like a serious point here. There is a process that you go through, and a lot of it is maybe a little bit kind of, it's not necessarily quantitative, it's more of a qualitative thing. But this is something that you can point at if you're ever asked, what was your methodology for doing this research? There's a question that sometimes arises, how do you know whether to go after attacks or proofs? And what you actually do is you start in a quantum superposition of these two states. Okay? You're in a superposition of attack and proof mode, and then you look at the system until the quantum wave function collapses either to attack mode or proof mode. Okay? Good. I'm glad some of you think that's potentially humorous. Okay, I like this picture which kind of describes the process. So here are Schrodinger's plates. The plates are both broken and not broken at the same time. Okay, and this is like cryptography. And then when you open the cupboard, well, in this picture, the plates always land on the floor and they smash. But maybe if the plates are stacked a little bit more neatly, like they should be in a good cryptographic system, you won't get this effect. Okay, good. So that's a little bit about the methodology and how we go about doing it. What I'd like to do now is present you with a couple of case studies of this methodology in action. Okay? And the first case study, we'll see how we go for time. The first case study concerns cloud storage. And this is really, as the picture indicates, we have users who want to upload their data and store it in the cloud using some kind of service provider. I'll show you some examples on the next slide. They want to be able to authenticate to the cloud. They want to be able to upload files, download files. And crucially, they also want to be able to share files with other users. So many of you are probably using something like Dropbox, for example, or equivalent services to that, right? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about here. And the slide says 100 zettabytes of data will be stored in the cloud by 2025. And that's from a report in 2020. So I hope that's going to come true at some point this year. Okay? And I actually don't even know how big a zettabyte is. Does anybody know? It's like 10 to the 21 or something. It's a lot of data. There's a lot of data in the cloud. One thing to recognize here before we go any further is that in these kinds of systems, users are typically only equipped with a password, right? It's a human who is sitting at a keyboard, entering a password to remotely, to log into the system remotely, and then, do file upload and download kind of features, right? So humans are not very good at remembering cryptographic keys, so everything in the end is going to be based on password security. And that's kind of an inevitable feature of the way these systems work today. Of course, you can have multi-factor authentication and so on. Things are slowly improving there. But most of the commercial systems I'm going to talk about are just password-based. So here's some examples of some major services that provide this kind of functionality today. And what these ones all have in common is that all of the cryptographic keys are controlled by the server, not by the user. Okay? So the server knows the keys that are used to encrypt data, decrypt data, and so on. Okay? But of course, we live in a world where we want to think about the server potentially being malicious. So we go back to the previous picture, and we add these little red horns. I guess my laser pointer's not working. We add these little red horns to the picture, and this indicates an evil server. And sometimes this causes confusion, so let me explain. I'm not saying that the service provider is malicious. What I'm saying is that maybe the service provider is not very good at operational security, and they get compromised by a group of hackers who then take control of their infrastructure and who want to read users' data. Or maybe the service provider is compelled by a government agency to provide access to the data. Okay? So the systems that I showed on this slide are essentially inherently vulnerable to this kind of attack, where either the infrastructure is compromised by external parties or they're coerced into cooperation and providing data. in the last decade or so, a whole bunch of other kinds of services have emerged where now the key is under the control of the user. Okay? So now the data can be encrypted locally by the user on their client machine, and then we upload ciphertext to the server instead of plain text to the server. So all of the encryption and decryption operations are now done on the client instead of on the server. And I've put a bunch of companies here who are kind of typical in this space. Right? There's another dozen that you can find, but these are some of the biggest ones that we could find in terms of the number of users. Okay, remember though that users are not good at remembering keys, and so actually it's not so much keys that are under the control of users, but they remember passwords, and then we have mechanisms for deriving cryptographic keys from passwords. Okay, so things like password-based hashing, for example. So one of these, the most prominent of these when we started this work was Mega. Mega is an end-to-end encrypted cloud storage provider. So end-to-end encrypted means, again, this idea that the keys are under the control of the users and all of the encryption is done on the client, and then all of the decryption is done on the client. So the server only ever sees ciphertext, encrypted data. It has more than 300 million registered users and more than 1,000 petabytes of stored data. So it's a pretty big system. They've been around for quite a long time, and they make very strong security claims about the service that they provide. Okay? I'm going to show you a screen grab from their website. Security that's always on. We protect your data with zero-knowledge encryption, the highest level of online security and privacy. Now, I know that many of you are not kind of like fully trained cryptographers. All I want to say is that this is a red flag. The reason it's a red flag is that nobody in the scientific research community doing cryptography has ever heard of zero-knowledge encryption. It's not a thing. What it is a marketing term in this industry. So the majority of these service providers here claim to offer zero-knowledge encryption, but it doesn't correspond to anything that I've ever seen written down in a research paper. Okay? You can sort of imagine what this might be, right? Like it means that we do encryption and the server has no knowledge of how the encryption was done or what the key was or what the password was, okay? That's kind of what it's meant to convey, I think, as an idea. But like zero knowledge has a very specific technical meaning in cryptography, right? We talk about zero knowledge proof systems, for example, like one of the most exciting and innovative tools that we have in cryptography, but that's not what these systems are doing, okay? And then there's no such thing as zero knowledge encryption, so far as I know. Maybe I should write a paper about it, and then I wouldn't be able to say this anymore. Okay, so this for us was a bit of a red flag, this particular claim. So we decided to take a look. And let me just explain a little bit about how Mega works. There's a so-called key hierarchy. So at the top of this hierarchy is a key called KE, and that one's derived from the user's password. Okay, so users are encouraged to choose long, secure passwords, and then we make a cryptographic key from that, essentially by applying a hash function. And then we use that key to encrypt a master key, KM, and then the master key is used to encrypt file keys and also an RSA key pair. So some of you probably know about RSA public key encryption. You've probably seen it in your crypto class. This is what this is. And then we also have, so we have this RSA key pair, and we have the file encryption keys that are both encrypted using the master key. Okay, and another sort of red flag here is that the encryption algorithm that's used is something called AES ECB. ECB stands for Electronic Codebook. What that means is you kind of encrypt the data one block at a time using the advanced encryption standard. Okay, and this is known not to be a good way to use a block cipher, but it's what Mega uses everywhere. I also want to point out that the RSA key pair is used for file sharing. So if you want to share a file with your friend, you get hold of his public key and you encrypt the file key to that public key. And now your friend can use its private key to decrypt and recover the file key. Okay? I'm not even explaining here how the file encryption is actually done. It's not relevant to the rest of this discussion, but they actually use a weird way of doing that as well. Okay, it's also not great. So I was saying this about the file keys and the RSA key. Oh yeah, is used for file sharing, but it's also used in an authentication protocol. So the same RSA key pair is used for two different functions, for file sharing and also for user authentication. So during the authentication login procedure, the user kind of proves that they know a password that can be used to decrypt the secret key or the private key and then be used to decrypt some challenge message. Okay? Now, this is an example of key reuse, the same key being used for two different purposes. And we always read in textbooks that this is a bad idea without really having any kind of killer examples for why it's a bad idea. Here is the killer example. Okay? It turns out like this is like a really serious weakness in Mega's use of cryptography. Let me just explain a little bit about how ECB works with an example. Here's Tux, the Linux penguin, and here is the ECB algorithm. So EK here represents the AES block cipher with some fixed key K, and the way that it works in ECB mode is we just take our plaintext and we split it up into blocks, P1, P2, and so on. So imagine taking the penguin and slicing him up into thin slices. Okay, it's a bit of a nasty thing to do to a penguin, but we'll do it. And then we put it through the block cipher block by block, and then that gives us our ciphertext blocks. And if you do this, there's a famous picture, which I'm going to show you now, that shows the effect of using ECB to encrypt a penguin. Okay? Can you see the penguin? Yeah. And the reason you can see the penguin, or sort of see the penguin, is that ECB is always going to encrypt this fixed block of data in the same way. So if the same 128-bit block of data arises in your plaintext in two positions, you'll get the same output block from the block cipher with a fixed key. Okay? So that's why you have all this kind of repeated patterns in the image on the right-hand side. So ECB has been known for literally decades to have this kind of weakness, and we never use it in real systems, but Mega decided to use it everywhere. Okay? But keep in mind, Mega's not using ECB to encrypt penguins. They're using ECB to encrypt other keys, the file keys and the RSA key pair. So, you know, RSA private keys are not penguins, right? They have a lot of randomness in them. This kind of repeated pattern is not going to arise. But nevertheless, it's not a good way to do encryption. Okay, so how did we attack Mega? What did we decide to do? Well, first of all, we have to choose, after choosing the target, we have to define our threat model. We want to think about the security of Mega in the setting where we consider the service provider itself to be malicious. Why is that reasonable? Why is that a reasonable threat model? Because Mega themselves said, we provide zero-knowledge encryption. Right? We know nothing about your data, you don't have to trust us. So it's perfectly reasonable to say, okay, what happens if the server is malicious? What kind of security do you get in that setting? Our goal would be to recover this master key. If we could recover the master key, we can recover everything else. Okay? But in fact, we're not able to achieve that. What we can achieve is an ECB decryption capability under KM, meaning that we can give some ciphertext block to some kind of notional oracle and get back the decryption of that block under the master key. And that's good enough to recover file keys as well as the RSA private key. So we don't actually recover the master key, but we get something that's almost equivalent to that. Okay, which enables us to break individual files, to forge files, to recover the RSA key, to decrypt shared files, all kinds of stuff. Everything is broken, essentially, if we can achieve this goal. And we want to measure the attack cost. Normal way of measuring attack cost is like how much computation did you have to do? How many clock cycles did you consume? How much memory did you need for the attack? But these attacks exploit this this key reuse functionality between the authentication protocol and the file sharing. Okay? I'm not today really going to explain exactly how the attacks work. For that, you can maybe have a look at the paper if you're interested. But the fundamental reason that the attack is possible is because of this key reuse problem that I mentioned earlier. But the way the attack works requires the user to engage in a login process. And each time the user logs in, we learn a little bit more about their private key by doing some kind of manipulation. Okay? So we want to measure attack cost in terms of the number of logins for the user, because that's truly the kind of actual cost of the attack. The rest of the attack is computationally kind of trivial. So what we were able to do in our paper at Oakland 2023, so IEEE Security and Privacy is like one of the top conferences in the security field, and we had this paper published there called Mega, Malleable Encryption Goes Awry. So you see the acronym. Awry, it's an English word that means wrong. Okay, it's an English word that means wrong that begins with A, so we could make it into mega. Right? That's why we chose it. That was my contribution to the paper. Okay, so what did we manage to achieve? Well, our attack worked and would recover the RSA private key and also give us this kind of Oracle decryption capability, but it needed 512 logins by a user to do this. Okay, so we disclosed this to Mega with a coordinated disclosure, and Mega patched everything. And here I want to give full credit to Mega. They were really excellent to work with. They responded within 20 minutes to our initial email, and the response came from the CEO. Okay, this is really kudos to them. And then they developed a plan for how to fix things, and we told them it wasn't a good plan. And then they said, okay, we'll update the plan. And it still wasn't the best plan, as I'll explain in a moment, but they did something that was sort of path of least resistance, and I'll explain why in a couple of slides' time. One of the things they said, which I thought was really interesting, this is in an interview that they gave to Ars Technica, which is one of these online technical magazines, full of really cool articles if you don't know it. The CEO said this. I'll read the important part. The identified vulnerabilities only negate the guarantee, so we only break the system, if the user has logged in more than 512 times. And then it goes on to say, customers, okay, so basically we're unaware, we think that very few users would have logged in more than 512 times while under this potential attack. So basically, the CEO is saying, as long as you don't use our system too much, it's secure. Right? We would like something stronger than that. Okay? So this is a very interesting kind of playing a get-out-of-jail-free card in the middle of a game of Monopoly, right? Is like, well, nobody logged in that much. And that was kind of annoying. Not only to us, so a few weeks later, another paper came out by Keegan Ryan and Nadia Henninger, and they got it down to 6 logins. And I'm absolutely convinced that some users did log in 6 times. Okay? But what I say about their paper is it came out after the system was patched. So their attack didn't actually work anymore. Their improved attack was against an old version of the system, let's say. But it was still a demonstration that this was not a wise thing to say. 6 logins. And I was still sufficiently annoyed, not so much by the quote from the CEO, but by the fact that somebody did better than us. They got it from 512 down to 6. I wanted to go further, so we published another paper, this time at Eurocrypt 2023, where we broke the patched version. And I'd love to explain how we did that. It was way more complicated than the first attack that we found, because they had made it harder by patching the system, but we still found some nice ways of doing things. And the attack is now 5 times as expensive as the original attack, but the system was meant to be improved. Okay? But the really cute thing about this paper is, like, right near the time that we were about to publish the paper, we realized, oh, these ideas can also be used to break the original system again, this time with only 2 logins. And I'm absolutely certain that some users logged in twice for this system. Of course, again, this was against a system that had since been patched. So if you're interested in learning about the details, the paper is actually very accessible in the sense of it only requires like basic understanding of RSA and a few more basic things in cryptography. Like basically anybody who's done a bachelor's level course in cryptography could read this paper, any of these papers, and get the gist of what's going on. So Mega had to patch twice in response to the first attack and then our second attack. And actually, after the second set of attacks, they really did listen to our advice, finally, and did a much more extensive update to their cryptography. One of the problems they had, though, was they couldn't really change the cryptography because they don't have any of the keys. They can't decrypt the data on their servers and then re-encrypt it under some new algorithm or some new way of setting up keys. They have to rely on the users to download all of their data, decrypt it, re-encrypt it under a new algorithm, and then upload it again. And that's difficult if you have 1,000 petabytes of data, right? We estimated that running full speed across all of AWS data centers, it would have taken 6 months just to download 1,000 petabytes. Okay, so not so easy to do. So what I would say is like a key takeaway here is if you're going to design a large system, you better design it right at the beginning, because it's very hard to patch these things in operation or in flight, okay? And what this means is if you don't understand cryptography, don't try to design such a service, right? Hire some cryptographers. There are good schools like ETH producing lots of great cryptographers, and they should be hired. Okay, good. I did mention that the disclosure with Mega went really, really smoothly. Both times that we did it, it was really great. They even paid us a small bug bounty. We don't do it for the bug bounties, but nice to get a little bit of recognition that way. My favorite quote from the disclosure is this one here, which I've highlighted. We are extremely grateful for the privilege of having been chosen as a target. This is awesome, right? This is like, these guys know how to play the game, right? Because other vendors are like, who the hell are you? Get out of our face. Or we're going to sue you. Or, they just don't respond to your emails, right? Whereas these guys are like, they responded in 20 minutes and then publicly said, we love this. We want more of this. Okay? This is a great vendor reaction. There's quite a bit of public reception for this work as well. This is from Hacker News, which I guess you all know. And Thomas Patatek there, he's often posting on cryptography, and he's like a real big fan of cool attacks in cryptography. And he came up with this phrase, which I've now stolen and I use everywhere, of talking about stunt cryptography. Right? And what this means is like, we had to chain together a bunch of different vulnerabilities to get this attack to work in the first place. It wasn't so trivial to get it to go. And I think he really appreciated this kind of combination of things that we did to make a paper. So stunt cryptography is like a really nice phrase to describe what we do. Okay. What about the scientific reception? So as I mentioned, we published this paper at Oakland, or S&P 2023. We got really nice reviews, and even better, and this is an incentive for you to study cryptography. We actually won one of the Distinguished Paper Awards at the conference that year, and they gave out 10 Distinguished Paper Awards, and actually 4 of them were for cryptography. And these are 4 really awesome papers. They're really great papers, every single one of them. And so this is to say, do great research in cryptography and then submit it to security conferences rather than cryptography conferences, and they will give you a Best Paper Award. Okay? Maybe. Okay, so the scientific reception here from the security community was very good, but as I'll explain later, it's not always so good. So sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you get unlucky. What went wrong with Mega? Well, there's that list of attacks that I mentioned before, and all the things I highlighted in red were used in our sequence of attacks against Mega. So the summary here is mistakes were made. Okay? They got a lot of things wrong in their cryptographic design, and we were able to kind of combine all of those mistakes to get really quite devastating attacks against Mega's system. Now, let's go back to this picture. You might be wondering, well, if Mega was so bad, what about the rest of them? And of course, that's the kind of question as researchers we ask ourselves, right? Follow-up work. So we took a look at Nextcloud next, because it's one of the bigger ones. And we had a paper at Euro S&P last year, 2024, called Share with Care, Breaking End-to-End Encryption in Nextcloud. So we broke Nextcloud. Nextcloud is used by large German automotive manufacturers, car companies, and German government, and all kinds of people are using it. And they had introduced a new end-to-end encryption feature, but they got it wrong. Let's see. Let's leave it at that for today. You can read the paper if you're interested. These 3 were analyzed in a paper by Jonas Hoffmann, who was a master's student at ETH at the time, and Kien Tuong Truong, who is a PhD student of mine at ETH Zurich. And they wrote a very nice paper entitled End-to-End Encryption, or End-to-End Encrypted Cloud Storage in the Wild, a Broken Ecosystem. So you can maybe imagine what's in this paper. What they found is that many of these systems had vulnerabilities in them, and there was a lot of commonality in the vulnerabilities, and I'll explain that in a moment. The one that we didn't break was Tresorit, and that's great because it's a Swiss company. And actually, Tresorit had done a pretty nice job with their cryptography. We did find 1 or 2 things where they were issuing certificates on public keys of users, and the CA was part of the server. Okay, so if you could take control of the CA, you could issue fake certificates for users, and then all kinds of attacks become possible. So there were some issues there, but they were more like security management issues than cryptographic vulnerabilities. So kudos to Tresorit for actually doing a good job. But I would say Tresorit is quite a complicated system, and I don't think we examined every single corner of how it worked. So it could be a good thing for someone to look at in the future and see whether they can find something that we missed. It's quite possible that we missed attacks. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to mention this part of the Hoffman and Truong paper. They kind of systemized what went wrong here and found a whole bunch of kind of anti-patterns or design anti-patterns where vendors over and over again were making the same kinds of mistakes. So key separation or violation of key separation really is a key one. Use of weak and non-standard cryptographic primitives like ECB mode everywhere. And like a really important one is this a conceptual misunderstanding of what public key encryption does. So public key encryption enables you to encrypt a message under a public key, and then the message should be only decryptable by the person who has the corresponding private key. Okay? But it doesn't give you any guarantees about where the encryption was done or who did the encryption. It only gives you guarantees about who can perform the decryption operation. Okay? And what a lot of these systems would do is accept a public key encryption ciphertext and then assume that it must have come from some trusted party. But it could have come from the adversary. And we saw this over and over again in this line of work, that people were making that kind of mistake. And other ones too. And a sort of more general point that is not in the paper, but my personal observation, is that a lot of these companies, although they're kind of providing secure services, they're using encryption everywhere, they don't know that much about secure code development, and some of them didn't know much about how to handle disclosures. So one of these companies, for example, when we disclosed to them, their enthusiastic engineers immediately started patching the code base in public GitHub repositories. And that's good, but that's not coordinated vulnerability disclosure, right? That's them going off and patching kind of. And the issue with that is that hackers might be watching the patches and then reverse engineer what those patches are about, and then go and exploit those vulnerabilities in unpatched versions of the software. So in this world, even if you're doing open source development, you need to patch in private and then push the patches to the public repositories and make sure that everybody updates their code at the same time, rather than just kind of randomly starting the remediation process. So yeah, there's quite a lot of kind of general lessons to be learned here. We were also kind of concerned that this ecosystem was so bad, so we started to think about, well, what can we do about this? Can we build up some formal foundations for this area? And so we published a paper at Crypto 2024, which is really trying to lay formal foundations for end-to-end encryption for cloud storage systems. Learning from all of the attacks that we found and all of the mistakes that vendors were making, and also drawing a lot on our experience from secure messaging protocols, because there's some similarities between these two kind of areas. So we designed a model and a system that allows you to do these kind of core operations that you need in such a system, using only standard algorithms with very good performance characteristics. So if you build a system here, it should work well, should be fast. And also, in contrast to a lot of the previous research in this area, we only want to make the assumption that users have identities, IDs, usernames, and that they can remember a password. A lot of the research in this domain prior to our work was assuming that users had, full-strength cryptographic keys, and that just doesn't reflect reality in this space. And then we, of course, developed a protocol or a set of protocols and gave formal security proofs for those protocols. So if you were to implement carefully according to our description, then you would have a good start on building a secure system. What we actually think needs to happen here in the longer run is that it would be good to kind of standardize something in this domain. In the same way that we have TLS as a standard, it would be good to have kind of a base standard for end-to-end encryption for cloud storage that lots of vendors could build on top of. They could add features on top of. And then we would get away from having this kind of continually broken ecosystem. Okay, so yeah, another pointer here then is that, I explained there's this kind of thick line separating products, cryptographic products, from this world of research and standards and so on. And the mega case and all these other examples really illustrate how thick that line is, how hard to penetrate that line is. But another nice observation is that the standard model should really include a big arrow going back in the other direction, which is where you look at what's out there in the wild and you realize, oh, as researchers, we haven't yet developed some useful science here that people could use to build better systems, okay? So I would say the model should also have this arrow on it as well, where we look at what's in the wild and then we bring it back to the research world. We get to write nice research papers like this one that hopefully in the future will be a foundation for companies working in this space. Okay, so that's the first case study. Let me talk a little bit, maybe for 5 or 10 minutes, about Telegram. Anybody in the room using Telegram? Wow. Can I just ask you all to delete Telegram? Maybe by the end of this talk, I'll have convinced you why you should delete Telegram. Maybe some of you already know. So here, Telegram is great, right? It's a very nice app. It's very nice to use. It has lots of channels. You can get lots of things on there, and you can communicate with people, with your friends and family. It's also super popular. So these are statistics I got just the other day, and it's now the third most popular messenger out there, with getting on for 1 billion users. Okay, way behind WhatsApp and WeChat, but the third largest. So they have some very nice things on their web pages about privacy and security. They say, I can't even read that, Telegram messages are heavily encrypted and can self-destruct, okay? Telegram keeps your messages safe from hacker attacks. Okay, very good. Let's look briefly at the Telegram architecture. So Telegram, from a security perspective, has two main protocols. It has an end-to-end encryption protocol, so that would protect messages from Alice all the way to Bob, the two communicating parties. And it also has this client-to-server protocol, which protects the communications between your app on your phone and the Telegram servers. Okay? Those Telegram servers are distributed all over the world. There are servers in places like Amsterdam and, I don't know, all kinds of countries. So it's like a distributed server infrastructure that they have. One thing to say, and this is really why you should delete Telegram, is that the end-to-end encryption is not enabled by default. And actually, if you try to enable it, you have to navigate a maze of menus, and you can only enable it conversation by conversation, right? You can't just switch it on by default for all of your communication. So if you're communicating your most valuable secrets and your medical condition and your love life status to your friends, be aware that the people working for Telegram can read all of those messages. Okay? And worse, the security agencies that have penetrated Telegram servers can also read those messages. Okay? I don't know whether Telegram servers have been penetrated or not, but I can tell you they're a high-value target. Okay? And the adversaries are very sophisticated. So for this reason and this reason alone, you should delete Telegram and use something like Signal or WhatsApp. Use Signal. That's the easiest thing to say. I mean, look, even the American government is using Signal. Sorry, I had to put that joke in. Okay. The client-to-server secure communication is provided by this thing called MT Proto 2.0. Now, let me throw the question out to the room. If I ask you to give me a secure protocol for communication between a client and a server, can you make a suggestion to me? What would you use? Gentleman there. Thank you. Which version of TLS would you use? Perfect. Perfect answer. Use TLS 1.3, right? In the year 2025, no organization needs to design its own version of TLS, or TLS 1.3, to protect the communications between a client and a server. We have well-established protocols for this that are standardized, that have been heavily analyzed by the world's best cryptographers and found to be secure. Okay? Telegram does not need MT Proto 2.0. And clearly people have asked them this, because this is from their FAQ. This I cut and pasted yesterday. They're asking the question, why are you not using X insert solution? So why are you not using TLS? Their answer is, well, other ways of achieving the same cryptographic goals undoubtedly exist. We feel that the present solution is both robust and also succeeds at our secondary task of beating unencrypted messengers in terms of delivery time and stability. I can tell you that MT Proto 2.0 is much, much slower than TLS 1.3, okay? It does not perform as well as TLS 1.3, so I really don't know what this is about, okay? I think it's about, we designed our own protocol, and we think we're pretty good at cryptography, so we're going to stick with that. My job is to convince you they're wrong, okay? And we did this in 2 papers. The first paper is called 4 Attacks and a Proof for Telegram. I don't know if you remember the movie 4 Weddings and a Funeral. This is meant to be, you know, the funeral is the proof, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't really work. We thought it was funny at the time. And we realized we're not very good at coming up with funny paper titles, because our new paper, which will be published at Eurocrypt this year, is called Analysis of the Telegram Key Exchange. You can ask for a more boring title than that. So I'm going to just briefly talk a little bit about what we did in these two papers, and then maybe I'll wrap up. The first paper, we just looked at how does Telegram use symmetric cryptography, okay, to build a secure channel. So it assumes that some key exchange protocol has been run, a bit like the TLS handshake. Now you've got cryptographic keys. How are you going to use them to actually encrypt data? And here's what Telegram does. Okay, there's this complicated encoding. Your message gets encoded into a packet format. And then it uses a MAC and encrypt construction, okay? And this is well known not to be the right way to do it. You should always use encrypt then MAC if you're going to do something like this. But Telegram does it this way. And what's very interesting is that the output of the MAC algorithm, which is there to provide integrity, is used as an input to a key derivation function to make the key and the initialization vector for the encryption algorithm. If you didn't understand any of that, don't worry. It's just kind of like a non-standard way of doing things. Okay, so if you have a strong cryptographic background, you might see that that looks a bit funny. Okay. Also, notably, they invented new MAC and key derivation function schemes. So the MAC scheme is basically applying SHA-256 to a concatenation of a secret and the string that you want to MAC. Okay, and this is known to be not a good way to build a MAC algorithm. But still, that's what they did. And then their KDF is basically applying SHA-256 with the corresponding keys in two different positions in the input to SHA-256. This is like nuts, right? We have things called key derivation functions like HKDF we could just use here as a standard thing. So why are they inventing new MAC and KDF schemes? Why are they not just using standardized schemes that exist and are well understood? If we dig a little bit deeper and look at the actual encryption algorithm, it uses something called IgE mode to turn a block cipher into an encryption algorithm. You saw ECB before, and you saw that it was, had problems. This is IgE, and the thing about IgE is it's not standardized anywhere, and its security is not that well understood. So why not just use a standard mode and be done? And then a lot of the things that you might worry about are just taken off the table, right, if you use a standardized mode. You might wonder, where do these keys come from, MK and KK? Well, they come like this. So there's a key exchange protocol, which I'll talk about in a little while, and it sets up a shared Diffie-Hellman value, g to the xy. So g to the x is sent from Alice to Bob, and g to the y from Bob to Alice, or from client to server and server to client. And that gives us a bit string, essentially. It gives us a big integer mod p for some prime p, and then we convert that into a bit string. So here's a representation of that bit string in the blue box. And here's how Telegram makes the keys. There's the client to server keys, which are taken as these chunks of this raw Diffie-Hellman value. And then the server to client keys are taken from those chunks. Okay? So notice that these chunks are overlapping. So there are some key bits that are used in one direction and in the other direction, but in different positions in the keys. And this is just really bad, right? There's no need to do this. In fact, there's plenty of material here that you could avoid any overlaps whatsoever, even though you're making many keys. But you shouldn't actually be using raw bits from a Diffie-Hellman value to make a key. You should be applying a key derivation function to the raw Diffie-Hellman value to make a random uniform bit string, and then take keys from that. Okay? So this is like cryptographically wrong on multiple levels. Okay? And our poor developer here, actually this is Lenka Marakova. This is she was a PhD student at the time when we did this work. Now she's a postdoc with me. She's asking, essentially, what the hell? Right? What's going on here? So we were motivated to take a look, and we actually found 4 attacks, as I mentioned from the paper title, against Telegram. And the first attack is actually completely practical and quite impactful. The server is able to reorder the messages on the secure channel between, an external attacker is able to reorder the messages on the secure channel between the client and the server. So you can change the semantics of the sequence of messages, okay? We call this the pizza crime attack for reasons I won't go into here, but you can change how messages are perceived by receivers. And then we had 3 more theoretical attacks that were not, I wouldn't claim they were practical, but they all show somehow the brittleness, the fragility of Telegram's design. What about this proof aspect? Well, we were able to tweak the protocol, and by doing that, we were able to come up with a security proof. But it was actually very hard work. It's like 60 pages of math to get it to work. And we actually had to come up with a new security model to handle this because of the way the keys are overlapping. We were able to rely on lots of standard cryptographic assumptions with a little bit of work, but we also had to make some non-standard cryptographic assumptions in order to get the proof to go through, okay? And the reason for this is because of the weirdness in the design. A clean design would not require any new non-standard assumptions to be made to get a security proof to go through. So that was back in 2022. Let me tell you a little bit about the new paper that we wrote. We decided after a break and a recovery period to try to analyze the key exchange in Telegram. And this resulted in a 117-page paper in like A4 wide, small font, right? It's like a huge job to analyze this thing. And here is the thing. So it's pretty small font. I apologize for that. I wanted to squeeze the full horror of the protocol onto one slide. Okay? And this is not even it, right? So this is like an abstraction of what's really going on in the protocol. Each of the little bits of text here expands into like a whole algorithm on its own. But just to give you some high-level features, it's actually two protocols in one. There's a two-stage protocol and a three-stage protocol. And when you first register with Telegram, you run the two-stage protocol, and then you run the three-stage protocol repeatedly after that. And that enables you to set up new keys. But the two protocols are somehow kind of connected to each other with some kind of binding mechanism, which is quite hard to analyze. Stage one is using RSA encryption to transport a secret number, NN. That's what it's called in the specification, NN. And then we derive a key from NN in stage two, and we use that to symmetrically encrypt a Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So we're doing Diffie-Hellman key exchange in a mod P group, but we're actually encrypting the Diffie-Hellman values. And there's no reason to do that, right? The whole point about Diffie-Hellman is the values can be sent in the clear, but then the resulting secret is only known to the communicating parties. It turns out that they don't actually want to encrypt, they want to authenticate this data, and their encryption scheme is just good enough to give you that authentication, but more by luck than by judgment, I would say. And then there's part three, or stage three of the protocol, and it's providing a kind of key confirmation property in this binding that I talked about. But for reasons we never really fully understood, it doesn't use MT-Proto 2.0 to do it, it uses MT-Proto 1.0. So it uses their previous version of their secure channel protocol to protect some of the messages. And that protocol was broken. Okay? So it could be that that leads to a vulnerability in Telegram because they were using an old version of their secure channel protocol. So it's a very complex protocol, and there was really no prior security analysis, computational security proof for this protocol. And it uses many non-standard cryptographic building blocks to get there, to build the protocol. And what I want to do is, and this is maybe now aimed more at the experts in the room, I wanted just to lift the lid a little bit on what kind of cryptography is being used. So after our previous paper, Telegram updated how they were doing RSA encryption to prevent an attack that we found. And they switched to using something called, well, it doesn't have a name. It's based on something called OAEP+, which is a standardized algorithm invented by Victor Shoup, who's like a renowned cryptographer. But they adapted it to their own environment for reasons we don't fully understand. So we call it TOAP+, for Telegram's version of OAP+. And here's the pseudocode that we analyzed. And I just want to highlight a few features. First of all, it has a while loop. It does rejection sampling to make sure that the end encoded RSA ciphertext is smaller than the modulus n, okay? Rather than using some bit encoding trick, which is like the standard way of doing it. So the encryption actually can fail, and you can go around and around this while loop until you end up with something that's small enough. It uses SHA-256, which is a good hash algorithm, but actually OAP requires long hash outputs, and they don't have them here. So it deviates from the expected behavior of OAP+ at this point by using a good hash algorithm, but one that has short outputs. And then they use IgE mode again to encrypt something inside the algorithm, where actually that's not the standard way of doing it, right? So this is another deviation from the standard. Let me show you another thing. Here's their KDF. So they wanted to make long keys from short keys. So the input is a key k and some public value x. And the right way to do this is to use something like HKDF. It's a standardized algorithm. And what they do is they use SHA over and over again, and they kind of vary the inputs to get kind of different outputs, right? So they run SHA with K concatenated with X, and then X concatenated with K, and then K concatenated with K, and that's still not enough. So on the end, they put some of the input key bits as output key bits. Okay? And if you know anything about cryptography, this is just crazy, right? The point of a key derivation function is to make a completely new key from an old key that's somehow independent of the old key. And now we have these repeated bits, right? So it's also using SHA-1, which is bad. There's these key bits on the end, and then there's this weird kind of variation of the inputs. So in short, this is not the way to design a key derivation function. They have this encryption algorithm, hash then encrypt, which uses IgE again. At least they're consistent in using IgE. And they're also using SHA to create like a message digest at the start of the cipher, of the plaintext, which is then encrypted using this IgE mode, okay? And this is known in general not to provide a strong encryption algorithm, but for reasons it turns out that it's just enough, just gives you just enough security to give you integrity for the key exchange messages, okay? But again, they were lucky in a way. And then I actually put in pink the entirety of the decryption algorithm because it's just insane. What it does is it has, so there's random padding being added in step 3 here on the end, but there's no indication of how much padding was added. So you have to do trial decryption with all of the possible padding lengths, right, in order to detect how long was the padding. And you do that by checking whether the SHA value is correct. Okay? So this is like really inefficient. This requires on average 16 SHA operations to do one decryption. 8 on average. So this is just like not an efficient way to remove padding. And then here is channel V1. Don't try to read all of this. I'm just going to highlight the entire thing in pink, right? It's bonkers, okay? And it's broken anyway. We tried very hard to find attacks, and we couldn't, which is really, really annoying. So in the end, we did find one hypothetical attack, but it was really, really theoretical in nature. It required many executions of the key exchange algorithm, and we disclosed it to Telegram, and they did address it. They didn't tell us that they addressed it, they just addressed it, and then later we asked, did you fix that? And they said, yes, we fixed it. But anyway. What we did was actually we developed security proofs for this beast of a protocol, for the 2-stage protocol and also for the 3-stage protocol. And for this, we had to kind of use state-of-the-art security models for key exchange, and we were able to prove the kind of classical properties that you expect of a key exchange protocol, including forward security, but not post-compromise security, and some authentication properties. Along the way, we had to prove that Telegram's version of OAP Plus was actually in CCA secure, that it met the standard notion of security. This took like 12 pages of analysis, something like that. And also a proof that this hash then encrypt scheme gives us some kind of integrity property that we need for the protocol. Okay, and along the way, unfortunately, to get this to work, we had to make some unusual assumptions that deviated from kind of standard assumptions that you make in cryptography. And this was essential to get the proof to work, okay? And these assumptions that we made, we tried to minimize them. We tried to make them as simple and as clean as possible. And they do provide new targets for cryptanalysts. People who break SHA-1 or SHA-256 might want to look at these and see whether they are really true or not. But we were forced to make this kind of assumption just to get a proof to work. Okay, so the key takeaways from this part are to say that the key exchange protocol is not broken, but it's very brittle, in our opinion. Like, there are many things that had to go just right for the protocol to be secure, and it doesn't really have the robustness that you might want from such a protocol. And our analysis was really frustrated by the design of Telegram. And it was a huge amount of work even to write down what is the protocol doing, because we had to analyze lots of different sources of information and also read the source code to really resolve uncertainties about how it was working. Okay, here's a quote from our paper. This is Appendix I of the paper. So there are appendices A through H before you get to Appendix I. That gives you a sense of how long this paper is. And basically, the key takeaway here is that a cryptographic design is also tasked with being easy to reason about, okay? Because we want to be able to do analysis and we want to be able to prove things about cryptographic protocols and systems and not just hope that they're not broken. So it's incumbent on the designers of these systems to actually design them in such a way that facilitates analysis, not frustrates analysis. And by that metric, Telegram really does fail, even though with reluctance, we were able to prove it secure. Now, some of you might be wondering, why analyze Telegram anyway, right? The cryptography is bad. End-to-end encryption anyway isn't enabled by default. Why are you giving Telegram this kind of stamp of approval by proving that their cryptography is actually secure? And the reason is this: the ship has already sailed. What does that mean? Telegram has 950 million users who are relying on the security of the system, at least for the client-to-server encryption, okay, which is on by default. If that was really, really bad, 950 million users would have their data exposed, okay? So we agree that the cryptography is not great in Telegram, and yet we analyzed it anyway because of the importance of Telegram in the broader picture. Okay, so I think I've gone well over time. I hope those 2 case studies were interesting for you. I have some additional slides, but I'm just going to, these are more about the meta-level discussion of crypto in the wild. I'll just skip to the very last slide here. We'll get there. There we go. Not that one. Okay. I guess you recognize this meme. This is responding to something that happens in the scientific process where we're often challenged. You know, you're looking at a fixed real-world system. Why is that scientifically interesting? Right? And my argument in response is always this: science is the process by which we come to understand the world. Then this is science. Okay? We need to understand things like, why do developers make these mistakes? What mistakes do they make? Why do they make them? And how can we avoid them making these mistakes in the future? How can we do cryptography better in research that's more consumable by developers, that they can actually access the research that we're doing and make something good out of it? So that's reviewer 2, I guess, there in that picture. So I just want to mention that if you're interested in reading more about this, we wrote a paper describing our experiences of doing cryptography in the wild. It's called Cryptography in the Wild, a Retrospective. And it was co-authored with Martin Albrecht, who's a professor at King's College London, and probably, I think now he's my most prolific collaborator. We've written dozens of papers together, so it's always great working with Martin. This is Martin looking very serious and sideways at the Telegram source code, I think. Yeah. And also a big thanks to my research group at ETH Zurich, who put up with me kind of spending lots of time doing this stuff. Here's the group here. Lenka, who I mentioned as a co-author on the Telegram papers and also one of the mega papers, is here at the front. There's Lenka, and that's Matilda, who was a co-author on the first paper. Miro, the other co-author on that paper, is now a PhD student at UCSD in California. So I think that's maybe a good place to stop. Thanks for your attention. I hope we have some time for questions.